can't believe that we're down to our last 2 sessions. But we've got some things that are planned for some great next steps, so please stay tuned. I think you might have gotten an initial email, but we'll be talking some more about that. But the next step portion is such a good step for this process. What we found, this is our 4th cohort, as you know, is that it doesn't seem to get much easier thinking about how do we take the next steps, what are they that will help us take those. And so we're taking that piece of the work more and more seriously because we realize hearts are good, minds are ready, but people just need to know what steps do we take, how do we direct our feet, where do we go? We want to be able to help you with that. So just know that there's some things that are coming up. So a few things that we want to get into, just a couple of housekeeping things, and then I'd just like to give you some tidbits that are very interesting. Now, this does not make sense or does not important to everyone, but there are some basketball fans who are out there. Next Monday night is the NCAA basketball finals. So, if you're real diehard, you can just tape it and we can all swear to not talk about it during the session. But just please know, it'll be our last session. Dr. Shashko is talking tonight. Dr. Christy Clark-Pajara is coming back to do our last session. And so we want you to understand, so we want you to know that. So whatever you gotta do to do that, but the last session is really important because she talks about the cost of apathy. And that's really, really important because historically, we always get to a point where we say, oh, this is horrible, this sucks. And then people sort of back up and do nothing. We want to really help us to do something. So that's really important. The other thing is 2 weeks from tonight is our potluck. In the past, and that's actually built into your schedule, on the 15th, it'll be held at Wright Middle School, and Principal Angie, can you just wait for this moment? Is going to be our host. We had another place, another backup, but having someone who's participating in it, a Southside site, and history class, I just think it's just so great to be able to do that. I promised her that we would have an excellent takedown and cleanup crew. So she does not get in trouble with her custodial staff because, you know, the principal can deal with angry parents and they can deal with angry students. But when your custodial team gets pissed, ain't nobody happy. So I told her we were going to have the best takedown and cleanup team so that she can hold her head up high in front of her group. So those are the real important, some of the real important things. One other thing before I make a couple other points. Has anyone seen Us yet? Okay, let me tell you a spoiler. I'm kidding. I found out how to piss white people off. All right, No, I don't believe it. I have ex-friends who told me, anyway. One of the things that we did last year, I think after cohort 3, is we went to, here we watched together, Black Panther. We rented out a theater. So I just want to say this, that believe it or not, when we're not here with you, my staff is sitting down thinking of ways of continuing the education and the educational experience. And so we're thinking of movies that we'd love to process together, movies with panelists, movies with some real meaningful in-depth discussion, or non-African-American, really getting an African-American take on some of the movies. These are the things that we can do. We've talked about some things like trips that we want to do together, continuing potlucks where we can bring other friends into the discussion, or even training book groups. All of those things can happen, but it's going to take the response of you as individuals. And we'll talk more about what this means, but in the next week, particularly after Dr. Clark-Pajara's talk about the cost of apathy, we're going to talk about things that we want to present to this particular cohort, things that you can help us with that allows us to facilitate the kinds of continuing education opportunities that we really want to have. We don't want this just to stop right now, but we got some really important things that I think that we can do together. I want to just tell you a little bit of story that might give you some ideas of what partnerships can look like. So Ryan, can I just put the picture of me and some of the folks that are here? So through Twitter, all places, I got connected with one of the vice presidents at American Family Insurance. And we had a discussion about race relations, justified anger's work, my op-ed piece, etc. And so we went out and did a presentation on our work, and they gave us a grant. And it was the first piece. So it was, I mean, every piece, every grant is appreciative for. I mean, this is not a large grant, and I don't say that to diminish it at all. Sometimes if someone says a grant from American Family, you think, oh my God, grant. But this is an entry-level one. We sort of got into the process late. But I ended up sitting down and talking with one of the vice presidents, and we had a good discussion about what they want to see happen inside the organization, what they want to see happen inside around the city, and how can they be a part of the larger dialogue about race relations in Madison. And so we started talking, and I invited them to consider the history class. And so 11 people from AmFam, including their CEO, registered, paid for the class, came to the class in Cold War III. AmFam tried to take over. And it was a very powerful thing. Folks learned. You had like a VP of HR, which has a huge impact when we get to think about things. But after they went through the class, they realized that they had not really gone as deeply as they could in thinking about how do we make the environment in Madison or Madison area healthier so that we have a better pool from which to draw applicants. How do we make American Family insurance a place where people can really grow? So after we finished the history class, after they finished, we sat down and we processed. And they asked us two things. And let me show, can you show the next slide? They asked us, one, could we come to their site and offer cross-cultural leadership training to their staff? Could we work with their senior leaders on what it means to be a more inclusive organization? And they become our first history class corporate sponsor. And so I really appreciate that. Because one, it is terribly affirming of our work. Two, it helps us to understand that someone else gets the fact that what we're doing benefits the broader community. But three, if they're merely the grantor and we are the grantee, they get to tell us what the terms are. When they hire us to come in as consultants, we get to do this. We get to shift the table, and they understand this, where we get to say, here are things that you must do if you're really serious about being who you want to become. And so I say this because one, it helps us to do the work that we're doing, and again, it is terribly affirming. But I also want to share with folks that this was just an idea we had 3 or 4 years ago, and now we have this major sponsor. And so, but not only have they just come and said, hey, just do a miniature version of this history class. First of all, we don't do that, because that's not the equivalent of doing a small soft shoe. But if you go to the history class and you bring your executive level folks, we can do a follow-up with those folks. But they're asking us to do some coaching with their CEO and their executive staff to bring some training. And we're really looking at something that's very mutually beneficial. But they're asking us to help us to take a look at their environment, how they do outreach, how they hire, how they coach. And they really just opened the doors and said, we want to really partner with you. That is very important to me as an African American community influencer, because although we love grants, grants are how things work here, we are contracted, which means we are partners, we are business partners. If we don't produce, they don't have to pay us. But if we produce, they don't pay us. But this is a different shift for nonprofits. But I want you to understand, it is through the validity of this class, it's people coming together, it's people talking about the impact of it, and people taking next steps that's really helping to position us differently. So please, 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 now listen, I want you to really hear this piece. I mean, this makes me so glad I can even sing the American Family Insurance song. I'm practicing. I don't tap dance, but I do sing. But even though we have partners like this, and we partner with the Wisconsin Partnership Program, it's still individuals that have kept the movement alive for all of these years. So please, let's not do the thing that we do sometimes that you get a couple of corporate sponsors, we're like, you guys are good. We're trying to be more than good, we're trying to be an excellent community. But we need our partners, both on a corporate level, we need university, and you'll see with our faculty who are teaching. We need nonprofits to partner with us. We do need granting organizations to work with us. But we also need individuals to help us as well, because this is how we really get the work of this community done. And we're really up to the task. So I'm just really excited about this. If you work for a corporation or you're a CEO of a corporation and you want to know, well, what does this mean? What does this look like? You should contact me. You should email me. We'll send out information directly, and I can let you know what that. I can talk to you about that. Brian, I didn't even see that. That wasn't even planned. That's really good, Brian. That's good, Brian. That's working that white, man. That's called working that white. But the other piece is, some of you have come through this group. You come to this as a group. A number of churches have. United Way staff have done so. Our own area school district has. Right middle school teachers and other groups. I've taken pictures with you all. And you may be wondering, well, what's the next step for us? We may not want to be corporate responsible. We may want some training. Please, we want you to contact Harry Hawkins. And so we'll make sure that you have all the right contacts. We'll send it out. But this is something we've never, ever done before in the past 3 cohorts. We've never done it, but what we're realizing is we want to become really shrewd, because our fear is having the ideas and having the strength to do things and not having the resources. And let me just say this last thing, because I want to make sure that Dr. Shashko has enough time. If our class has taught you nothing else, it has taught you the economic disparity that has happened in this country. We've talked about the wealth gap, we've talked about redlining, we've shown you and even sent you emails showing you the ordinance saying that you cannot live in Sherwood if you're black, cannot live in Nakoma if you're black. This causes just huge economic disparities. If you don't think that flows down to communities of color, organizations of color that are run by people of color, you are missing the point of this. You probably can't name one major black foundation that funds this kind of work. And so even in this kind of work, we have to explain to predominantly white organizations why this approach to race relations works. Now, not to any of my friends who are here, but over the past 5 years, folks have said, this isn't really how you do it, you create more programs. So even though we know what's happening, we have people requesting us to talk about this history class all around the country. They're watching the photos, they're asking us, from Birmingham to the West Coast, to people in New York, how do you do this? How do you get non-black folks to come? How do you get a university to offer faculty to come and teach? We know what to do, but we have to still stand before predominantly white organizations and say why this is important to our community, because it's a very unique approach. And so what I'm saying is the economic disparities that has come from slavery and deconstruction and Jim Crow and Reconstruction still influence and impact our communities today. And what we're trying to do by finding ways to establish corporate partners and new ways of being granted or ways that individuals can serve us is to play catch up. Because we believe that the work is so important to be done that we can't deal with the stress of organizing this, finding the teachers, finding the students, organizing it so that you have a somewhat seamless experience, and then find all the funding on our own. That's the kind of stuff that kills people, black folks, brown folks, Latino folks, Asian folks. That's the stuff that kills us by trying to do all the work, design and convince people that it's real, that we got to do all the funding while the community watches us. This is our community. And we have a chance to do something that's very, very different. And there are organizations in here like AmFam who could become a sponsor also of the history class. And there are organizations here who have said we've done diversity training, but that cross-cultural leadership thing, like you want to take the next step with us, I just want you to know we have some great opportunities here. And we've created a menu of services that allows us to come in as a partner, and we can be an agency, an organization who you might consider having come in and working with your staff. And many of you work for companies that have budgets for that. So we just want to help you to think outside the box, because what Madison cannot tolerate is another start and stop effort. It's got people just afraid to even start anymore. When we started, because they said, we've said it before, we've heard it before, we've done it before, but nothing ever happens. Let's not allow that to be said on our watch. We think that we're onto something, We know that we can mobilize folks. We know that there is a need. We've already studied the ripple effect of our previous history classes. We know that we're onto something. And so find a way to just fit in where you can, because this is how we all work together to make a difference. I want this to last. I think our kids and grandkids deserve something bigger and better than what we have. And I think we need to model something that's, I think we need to model something that's I was eating in one of my favorite downtown places, SSE. I was at Shashko with one of my friends from Africa. And a black neighbor walked up. I didn't know that he was a neighbor when I was a kid, but he was with his whole family, and I didn't recognize him. I said, "Are you here on a college tour?" He said, No. He said, we live next door we live around the corner from your mom. So I remember you when you were a kid. And so my friend Jim was from Anthem, he was sitting there, and I said, well, your children look like they're getting college age. I'm an alum. My daughter just graduated from Wisconsin. My mom did, I did, my wife did. You should send your kids here. And he didn't say anything about the University of Wisconsin. He just said, no, my kids want to go south as soon as they finish with school. So when he left, he sat down, and I said to my friend, do you see what we're up against? This was nothing. They didn't say anything about one specific entity. It wasn't their high school, it wasn't the university, it wasn't law enforcement. They just said there's something about Madison that black kids born in St. Mary's Hospital, raised here, who know how to navigate Madison, are choosing to not navigate Madison because they don't want to exert that energy. We're losing our best and brightest. We're from this community who don't want to be from this community. We can do something to change that. We can let them see unity, we can let them see togetherness, we can let them see change, we can let them see sustained relationship, and we can let them see hope. But I don't know about you, but I worked too hard in this community to let my legacy be that I have served the best of my years in a community that is known as the most divided, the most, has the greatest racial disparity, has all the isms from the state that is the most segregated. I do not want that to be my legacy. And if you're like me, you've worked too hard to let people around this country say that about us. And so, let's be truly Madisonian. Let's live into our state motto of being forward. Let's not ignore that these statistics are real, and let's not let them subdue us. Let's use our intellect, our goodwill, our good thought, our good heart, and let's kick this problem square in the butt. And let's work together to make a difference in this community, because we can do more than wring our hands and cry. We can unify, we can learn, we can be mobilized, and let's make this community everything it can be. It's given a lot to us, that's why we're still here, so let's give it our best shot, all right? Does that make sense? These partnerships have made me want to kick in. Where's my friend Renee from United Way? Renee, we've had these talks, like, Renee, I'm tired, I want to move on, I think I'll look for some other place. We've talked, like, Alice, we need you here, you're angry, and I was angry, but underneath the anger is hurt. Because I'm a product of what Madison does when a single mom from Chicago who's going through divorce comes with 2 young kids. She got a master's degree and paid cash for her kids to go to college. I'm the result of Madison on steroids. But my anger is also the result of Madison when it closes the door and pulls its welcome mat in and says to black women from Chicago, what are you here for? More benefits? You can't handle the rigor of this school district, of this city, of this community. You don't understand the rules. And so I really was on my way out from this kind of work. I completed my doctorate degree so I could travel the country and be an itinerant lecturer so that I could just ride into retirement and just say goodbye to always having to explain, always having to sort of calm myself down, always have to breathe. And having 4 groups come through this history class, having this city sponsor 3 cohorts of African American emerging leaders. They've come from United Way, they've come from AmFam, they've come from the school district, they've come from all around this community to be built up as leaders. I'm watching this community rally in a way that I didn't think it would. And I want you to know I'm really motivated. So you catch me on a good day, maybe it's because it's after spring break, maybe because I got my tan on. I don't know what it is, but you caught me on a good day, so I want you to take it in, because next week I might be pissed as hell. But tonight, I'm looking at not only the opportunities, but the strides we've made There are a lot of things that I've said about Madison in 2013, but I see movement, I see compassion, and I see opportunity. Let's not allow this to slip from our hands. We really do have the wherewithal to work together, to believe in each other, to band together to make a real difference. Dr. Shashko is a friend and colleague. You've heard him before. He's going to be talking about things that happened in during my lifetime, many of our lifetime, about how folks work together in civil rights and how we made a difference. Let's not look at this as just a historic thing that can never happen again. When people begin to work together, huge change, great change can come. And so I took like 8 minutes of your time, Dr. Shashko, so you get to go a whole hour. You can go to 8:30 because this is your last time with us this year. But please come on back up, sir. And let's give us a Thank you, sir.
Welcome back. I need to start with an announcement. There is an SUV in the Firestone parking lot with its lights on, so if you have such SUV, I don't have any more details than that, but if you happen to have one and you want to get home, you might want to look into that.
743, I think, WYZ.
743 WYZ. So if that's you, we'll all just look down for a moment and slightly walk out. We've all been there. We've all done it. No shame in that. Somehow it's colder today than it was when I was here last time. I'm not exactly sure how that happened after a couple weeks of spring break, but here we are. And just one quick note before I get started on my talk today. I probably don't need to tell anybody in here this either, but tomorrow is election day. And people died for the right to vote. Not that long ago, they died for the right to vote, right? So take it seriously. Think about, you know, your civic responsibility. Think about the candidates who are on the ballot. I often get into conversation with students in particular about the value of voting, and my response is always that it's the least you can do, right? It's the least you can do. Do it, put it aside, move on to the harder work that is out there, but it's the least that you can do. So you ought to do it, and certainly call somebody up and remind them if you think they're on the fence about whether they're going to get out there tomorrow. First slide. Welcome back, Ron Howard. You are here again. Only a little bit older this time. The date of this picture is 1974, but of course, the moment is that mythical 1950s that I was talking about. There is Ron Howard alongside Henry Winkler, whose daughter went to school at UW-Madison, incidentally. And so every once in a while I would be walking around like in the humanities building, which is of course a grim experience for anyone who's been there and done that. But it was always bright because every once in a while Henry Winkler would be there visiting his daughter, and like the Fonz would just walk through the yard, which was just kind of a lot to take as someone who grew up in Shorewood just right next to Milwaukee. That's a big deal, right? So, but this is Happy Days, right? And this is the kind of image of the city of Milwaukee, and to an extent the state of Wisconsin, that still resonates across the country and around the world. When they announced where the Democratic National Convention was going to be a few weeks ago, and it ended up in Milwaukee, there were countless pieces about Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley, and this period from the 1950s, which is still what a lot of people think about when they think about Milwaukee. And again, there's a certain element and a kernel of truth to the way in which that story makes sense, and I talked a little bit about that last time. There are, of course, other stories to be told. Next slide. This is Forest Home Avenue in 1967 in Milwaukee. And this is the White Power March that was going on. Members of the Klan who were in the city itself at the time, who were there to protest the fair housing legislation that was being fought for in the city of Milwaukee. And this story, too, is of course part of Milwaukee's history. It is part of Wisconsin's history. And I always think that that is worth mentioning. This is a lecture about Wisconsin. Even though it will talk a lot about contemporary race relations and the civil rights movement in Wisconsin, based in Milwaukee, Milwaukee is part of Wisconsin. And as much as that seems silly to have to say, in a way you have to say it. because the way in which we have constructed our idea about how we see ourselves as a state and how we see ourselves as a culture has been to put Milwaukee at odds with the rest of the state. That being a true Wisconsinite is being someone who lives in a rural area, as being someone who lives, you know, in the sort of on the salt of the earth, right? Even though you have 1 million+ people who live in the Milwaukee metropolitan area, even though it is the center of the state's economy, even though it is very much a part of the state of Wisconsin. But politicians, as long as anyone can remember, across the state have run against Milwaukee as if it is some foreign entity that is not connected to the state. And as African Americans have arrived there, that distinction was only intensified in our popular imagination. This is a story about Wisconsin because it's Wisconsin legislators and the people of Wisconsin who also made decisions about where resources would be allocated, about where emphasis would be placed in our politics, about how we make decisions about what's best for all of us as a collective. And so even though a lot of what I'm going to talk about is about Milwaukee and to a lesser extent Madison, it is also the story of the whole state. And that does include the tension between Madison and Milwaukee, because that is a very real one too. Something that observers have noted for a very long time is that 90 miles between the two cities seems like a yawning gap at times, even among people who seem to be somehow in sympathy with one another politically. That gap is often very, very large. One thing I have noticed as someone who is someone who grew up around Milwaukee but is a resident of Madison now for 2 decades plus, is that a lot more people from Milwaukee have been to Madison than the Madisonians have been to Milwaukee. And the Madisonians who have been to Milwaukee have driven 94 straight to the Summerfest parking lot, or straight to the stadium, or straight to wherever they're going, and then straight back out. And I kind of get it, you know, I mean, if you're going to go to a big city, you could drive to Chicago and take another hour and do that, or drive to Minneapolis if that's where you want to go. I get it at that level. But one thing I want to point out before we even get started, something for all of you to think about as we talk about this story, is about going to Milwaukee and really seeing it. It doesn't mean driving around where you don't know where you're going, but it means spending some time there, because I think far too many people from this city don't know that city. And there's something really incorrect about that. And something really lost, you know, with Reverend G talking about the way you make these coalitions happen and make them a reality. That is very much a coalition that could be more of a reality than it is if people were willing to put in the time. So give that some thought as we talk through today's lecture. Next slide. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what happened after the Civil Rights Movement, in particular in the North. And so I'm going to start by giving a kind of overview of the politics of civil rights in the North, and then we're going to head into the story of Wisconsin and why it is that Wisconsin is as it is, why it is that we have the kind of racial disparities and the kind of segregation that we have, which even by the standards of America is particularly bad. When the Civil Rights Movement reached its apex with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it also reached a crossroads for several reasons. One was an ongoing debate about the nature of protest itself. What are the best strategies and tactics moving forward? Are the marches and are the protests, the way that they functioned in the South, going to continue to function in the North or elsewhere as the movement attempted to grow, or at least believed that it could grow? So that's a very important part, excuse me, of this story. There were also real conflicts and real questions about what to target. One of the benefits of Jim Crow segregation in terms of the movement was that it gave a target. There were laws, Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow segregation was something that you could target. It was on the books in the South. And no matter how people might have disagreed about tactics or strategy, they could agree that getting rid of those laws was a useful means to an end. And not only that, but Brown versus Board of Education had proved that to whatever limited degree it succeeded, the legal system was a way in which change might be achieved. And so you had this target. The problem was that in the North, you didn't have segregation on the books. The laws didn't explicitly say that you could engage in segregation in that way. What the laws did was create a vast structure that allowed for that segregation, but it didn't have that kind of explicitness. And so it made it more difficult to organize the movement in the North. What you had instead in the North was a long tradition of activism, a long tradition of people organizing. You think back to CORE and other groups before the civil rights movement itself, who had fought to desegregate elements of the North, who were attempting very much to bring back that sense of activism as we get into the late 1960s. But it's a different time, it's a different moment. There's a certain amount of fatigue in white America about the movement itself. There is a kind of self-congratulatory sense that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act is good enough, that you don't need to do anything other than that that'll solve all of the problems. And so you get a moment when there is increasing white resistance across the country, when there is a sense among many whites in the North that now that this movement is affecting them personally, that it's no longer abstract to them, that they have more reservations about it. And you have an activist movement that is becoming more strident about its expectations. In a sense, what happens as the movement goes on through the 1960s, and as we go through the later part of the civil rights movement into the era that we consider the era of Black pride or Black power, we have African Americans who are now feeling empowered to take advantage of the successes of the civil rights movement. In a sense, that's what Black power was. As much as we kind of imagine Black power as being this kind of radical movement, right? Again, the popular culture image of the guy in the beret and the turtleneck and all of that stuff, which was real for a few thousand people, what Black power really was for most African Americans was a sense of power. It was a sense of feeling like you now had the right to describe yourself in your own terms, to express yourself the way that you wanted to express yourself, to engage in the world in a way that didn't feel filtered to the degree that it had been before, and to take advantage of the opportunities, economic, social, cultural, that you always should have been able to take care of, but now take advantage of, but now you could. And so this is really the moment within which all of this starts to coalesce, and coalesce in northern cities like Detroit, like Chicago, like Milwaukee. And that's the story that I want to talk a little bit about for the two-thirds of what I'm going to talk about today. Next slide. So what happens when it moves north? Well, Martin Luther King and other leaders of the SCLC and SNCC are starting to think of what to do next. And they try a number of different things. One thing they do is to launch a campaign in the South called the Poor People's Campaign, which was meant to organize along class lines in addition to race lines, to bring in poor white people in the South who might share in some of their frustrations and their sense that they are not part of the American dream. That followed roughly along the same lines in terms of the timeline as the War on Poverty, is LBJ's attempt to try to do something about poverty in America and to use government intervention to do that. Both met with limited success for a number of reasons. One was that there weren't the kind of resources available that might have been available 10 years earlier to make it happen. There was a certain amount of exhaustion and dissension in the movements themselves. And also, among many whites, there was simply a lot of dissonance between their racial identity and their identity in terms of their social class, where they were not comfortable doing that kind of cross-racial work. And so you have a very complex time in which the movement is starting to stall, it's starting to sputter. The things that worked before in terms of organizing are not working in the same way that they worked in the past. And all of this is happening as the country is starting to change. And in particular, as we see deindustrialization across the country. You know, we think about the deindustrialization of the economy in the United States as something that happens in the 1970s, the 1980s, when the factories start to move abroad. But in fact, it happens much sooner than that. It just happened in a kind of silent way. Because in the 1940s and the 1950s, you had automation. You had jobs that used to be done with someone's hands now being done with machines more than ever before. This was seen largely as progress, right? Because for the people working in those factories, suddenly they didn't have to do the same kind of backbreaking work that they did before. The jobs become more managerial. They become based around technology. The problem with all of that was that as an entry-level job for someone who was coming out of poverty, looking for an entrance into the middle class, that wasn't an option. You had to have a certain level of education, a certain level of sophistication to get those jobs. So even before the jobs are gone, the opportunities for African Americans, for example, coming from the south to the north as part of that second great migration from the 1940s to the early 1960s are not there the way that they were before. They're simply not there. And so we see poverty start to grow as a result of some of these lost opportunities. At the same time that's happening, of course, African Americans also don't have social mobility. They can't move to where the jobs are, especially as they're going into the suburbs, because there is rampant residential segregation across the north. And that is why Martin Luther King picks Chicago as the target for his move to the north. That Chicago was a place where there was very clear residential segregation by race, where there was very clearly a black activist base. It had long been the sort of unofficial capital of black America, and so there were a lot of activists and there was a certain level of money. And he found a target. It wasn't those laws that existed in the South. He found a target, Richard Daley, the mayor, right? Because Richard Daley had a lot of power, right? He was, you know, one of the last of the true machine bosses. And so he attempted to go to Chicago in what was known as the Chicago Campaign and protest and fight to desegregate housing in Chicago. Housing in Chicago, which had been constructed along these, you know, highly segregated lines through a number of different systems. We already talked a little bit about redlining in here. Reverend G talked about that before. I certainly have that up there, and actually you can see in this map of Milwaukee, the red areas, right, on the near north side and the near south side are literally in red. You see that in that map? That is not some kind of like sort of underground secret map. That is actually a map that was constructed by the federal government that determined which communities were considered better or worse for handing out loans, for handing out federal housing loans, which was built precisely along the red lines that had been constructed in the city of Milwaukee at that time. So redlining is very real, and in fact, Wiscontext.org had a piece about Milwaukee and redlining just a couple weeks ago, and it actually has a really neat graphic where you can slide over from the current map of based on race in Milwaukee today and the redlining map, and it graphs over almost exactly, even today. So you had redlining, which was certainly segregating where people would have the opportunity to live. You had a number of other systems that were used over time to try to segregate people. One was something known as a restrictive covenant, and this was something written into your mortgage, written into your, into the purchase of property that said that you could only use it in certain kinds of ways. Now, restrictive covenants can often be relatively benign, right? They can say, for example, that you can only build to a certain height, or that you can only you can put a chicken coop in your backyard or not, to use a very Madisonian example of what you can do with these kind of things. But for decades, in the 19th and early 20th century, it said that you couldn't you couldn't sell your home to a black person, or to a Jew, or to whomever they wanted to write into that. And it was only in the early 20th century where that formally goes away. But here's the thing about all of this stuff up here. They formally go away. It becomes illegal to be involved in redlining or restrictive covenants or any of this stuff. Doesn't mean it really goes away, right? Because someone can own that home for 20, 30 years, and the mortgage, they pull out the mortgage, start selling it, and there it is. It's not the law anymore, but it is the tradition, and it is a kind of understanding that that's the way that things are going to continue to work. This is what I mean about the difficulty of the movement finding a target in the North the way that it did in the South. Everything was understood, it was implied over time based on the explicit segregation that had existed before. The same is true with exclusionary zoning, right? Which is the way that a municipality, a city or a county or whatever makes decisions about what kind of homes or businesses can be in a certain place. Can you build single family homes here or not? Can you build commercial spaces here or not? Well, exclusionary zoning was often used to keep poor people out, particularly poor people of color over time. And so even though it went away over time, the tradition of allowing certain people to live in a space or not continued. And it would continue because you would have a sort of, essentially a kind of collusion of real estate agents, civic leaders, politicians, and ordinary people who live in given communities who would simply perpetuate them, who would simply continue to make sure that those lines continue to be there, or to change them in a way that could be disruptive and could be divisive in its own way, right? To change the boundary of those red lines so that an area that was once all white might now be open to others. Now, why would you do that? To make money, right? To profit. That would be the reason to do that. And they would do that through something known as blockbusting, which was about bringing elements of the African American population or another minority population into a community in such a way that would create panic, right? So you sell one house to an African American family, and suddenly all the white people who live there are afraid that the demographics of the neighborhood are going to change, and they decide to panic sell, right? And sell right away, and sell in a way that will profit the real estate agents. And you didn't even have to sell a house. Often what would happen in Chicago and other cities, really across America, but certainly in the North, is that the real estate agents would hire a black woman to come into the community with her child and push the child around as if they lived there. And that could be enough to create this kind of panic, this kind of panic selling. So that you would sell at a premium, you would just want to be the first one out, and you would go, and suddenly the neighborhood would change. So this is what MLK was up against, and for the most part they failed in Chicago. For the most part the civil rights movement failed in Chicago. Richard Daley agreed to build more affordable housing in the city, but he did next to nothing to deal with actual residential segregation in the city. Ultimately he decided that it was more important not to alienate whites who voted for him as opposed to the strength of African Americans in the community itself. And so that initial foray into the North proved to be largely ineffective. Again, because the target was not there the way that they expected it to be, because a backlash had started to brew against the civil rights activism, which meant other things were going to have to happen. Other targets were going to have to be found. And that ultimately is part of the story of Milwaukee itself. Next slide. To tell this story about race in Wisconsin and in contemporary Wisconsin, I want to back up a little bit because I think it is important to understand something more about the political tradition of the state in order to understand how we get to the point where we are as segregated as we are. And I want to start in the late 19th, early 19th century with progressivism, right? Progressivism, which is the grand tradition of this city in particular, part of its legacy to the rest of the country, really in elements of the world, in terms of the ways in which progressivism tried to reform how government works and how it related to its citizens. It's important to know that at the end of the 19th century, Wisconsin politics was considered more corrupt than Chicago's. And it's not like Chicago's was bad, by the way, and it somehow was later on. It was considered incredibly corrupt, entirely controlled by corporate interests, filled with graft, political appointees who were placed into positions of authority and administration, and the progressive movement emerged in part as a response to that. Progressivism is a very hard subject to sort of clearly define because it was a number of different social movements that were all going on at the same time. You had the rise of the environmental movement and conservation that was part of progressivism. You had workers' compensation laws, other kinds of consumer laws, and also protections in terms of child labor and how people would be used and abused in business and how that needed to be regulated in some way over time. You have, of course, the direct election of senators and the way in which political reform occurs in a way so that ordinary people can participate more broadly in the political process. All of this gets wrapped up in what we come to know then as Wisconsin progressivism, as the fall of progressivism. And of course, in terms of the university, it's about the Wisconsin idea. It's about this connection between the state and the university, this way in which the knowledge of the university will also be knowledge that will benefit the state. So it's this sense of using public institutions to benefit everyone, who lives in the state. While all of this is going on largely in Madison, there is another movement that is happening in Milwaukee. That is the emergence of what comes to be known as sewer socialism, a subject which also came up recently when Milwaukee was announced as the home of the Democratic Convention, because there were many critics who came out immediately and said, well, this is the most socialist city in America. It's perfect that the Democratic Party is going to have its convention there. Make what you will of that connection. It is the most socialist city in terms of its history in America. The city of Milwaukee had a socialist mayor in 1960. And the legacy of socialism in Milwaukee was one that was really drawn from German migration, from the 1848ers who came to the city and brought with them a certain level of radicalism and a certain level of a certain kind of reform impulse. What made it sewer socialism was not that it was somehow in the sewer in a bad way. It was literally because they wanted to build the sewers. The socialists in Milwaukee were not particularly ideological, and in fact, most of them opposed the Bolshevik Revolution and opposed Russian communism. They did not see what they were doing as similar to that. What they did believe was a kind of social democratic idea that the state should be involved in building various different institutions in public spaces. So you get, for example, the lakefront in Milwaukee, which has very little development relative to other lakefronts in a big city, is largely because the sewer socialists decided that those parks should be a public space. They, of course, built the sewers. They also built what was, and still is, one of the largest public park systems of any major city in the United States. They built one of the first zoos, one of the first public museums. They were involved in all kinds of civic projects to create a kind of infrastructure for better living. And they are doing that at the same time that progressivism is going on in Madison and the rest of the state. As much as they've shared certain similar kind of beliefs and ideas, they were not exactly the same. And they were different groups of people who were involved in this, and this speaks too to what I was saying earlier about this gap between Madison and Milwaukee, that the political traditions, the people who were actually in charge, the emphasis that they placed on the various different work that they did, was just different enough that they were doing parallel kinds of works, but very rarely in tandem with one another. Part of what they did share, though, was a kind of reform impulse that extended into the domestic sphere, that extended into the idea that there are certain ways to live that are healthier, cleaner, more nutritious, better than the way that many people live. And that there are ways to help people do that, right? To live in the kind of domestic sphere, to live in the consumer sphere in a way that will be better for their overall health and their overall life, which was an extension in the sense of what they were doing in public spaces. That got complicated though, and it got complicated when it was about native-born Americans telling immigrants how to live. Telling immigrants that there was a certain right way to cook food, a certain right way to clean your house, or to clean your clothes. This is where it got complicated. And part of where the idea that progressivism and sewer socialism is paternalistic comes from this tension. It comes from this tension between this reform impulse and the sense that they were telling people how to live and telling them what to do. And that was particularly acute in Wisconsin because there were so many immigrants. This was a state built on immigrants, and German immigrants in particular. In Milwaukee and across the entire state, you had a German population that was very, very German in the way that it lived in this state. In many places, people only spoke German. In many cities, the newspapers were in German. It was a dominant culture, even though, of course, Germany itself was really built out of many separate cultures of its own. And actually, some of the reasons why we have our political divisions in this state can be traced all the way back to what part of present-day Germany ended up migrating to different parts of the state. In other words, there was one movement that comes into the Fox River Valley, for example, as opposed to what comes into Milwaukee, and the political traditions were significantly different. In any event, you have all of these Germans who come. Among other things, German was being taught in public schools in Wisconsin. And that became a source of great friction, and it led to what came to be known as the Bennett Law, which was a law that demanded that all public schools have all of their instruction in English. It was the most controversial law in Wisconsin history, up to Act 10. Maybe counting Act 10, I wasn't there. But certainly up to Act 10. It was the most controversial law in the history of the state. 2 years later, it was repealed, and German was brought back into public high schools in certain parts of the state as immigrants responded at the polls to what they saw as an unfair limitation of their culture. Why am I bringing all of this up? This seems pretty far afield from the topic. Here's why I'm bringing it up. All of those German immigrants then had to face World War I and World War II. Germany was now the enemy. German culture was now the enemy. And Milwaukee, which had been known as the Deutsch Athens, the sort of center of German culture in maybe the world at that point, but certainly in North America, that started to crumble. Suddenly, you see German newspapers go away. Suddenly, English is the only language taught in schools that go through the first half of the 20th century. Suddenly, all of those German beer gardens disappear. Suddenly, a lot of German names disappear. I would imagine there are people in this room whose families had German last names that were anglicized over the course of the 20th century. There was a real sense that German identity was something to be ashamed of, or certainly something to sort of conceal. This then became about two things. It became about patriotism and what it means to be an American, and it became about whiteness and who gets to be white. Right? Are you an immigrant or are you white? And even if you are a white immigrant, there is still a sliding scale. There has always been a sliding scale of whiteness in America about who gets to be considered truly white or not. In the 1830s, that meant the Irish. Right? Now, you often hear about the Irish. There's a sort of cliche that the Irish were considered black. That is not true. That is not true. Being black was something very different than being Irish. What was true, though, is that being Irish didn't necessarily mean being white. It didn't mean being a Yankee. It didn't mean being English. And that has been an experience that many people from Europe who were not from England or the British Isles experienced over time. First the Irish, later the Italians, the Slavs. You name the group, the Germans, and they all went through this in one way or another, determining how white they were actually going to be considered in American society. So why does all of this matter? Well, it matters because as you get towards the end of World War II and you get towards the 1950s, you have a white immigrant population in Milwaukee that very much feels compelled to prove its whiteness and to prove its patriotism. And who do we get in the 1950s in Wisconsin? Joe McCarthy. Right? Joe McCarthy and the kind of hyper-patriotism and the Red Scare that comes with Joe McCarthy. And so you have to understand that when African Americans start to come to Milwaukee and they start to come to Wisconsin as part of the Second Great Migration in the 1940s and 1950s, what are they coming to? They are coming to a state that is deindustrializing, even though that is largely hidden. They are showing up at the very moment that the tickets to the middle class are starting to disappear. They are coming at the very moment that there is this anxiety in Wisconsin about whether or not people are white and whether or not they are patriotic. This is what they are entering into when they arrive in Wisconsin. And it has real consequences for what happens as time goes on. Next screen. Among other things, what you get as a result of all of that is that there is not the kind of black middle class in Milwaukee, in Madison, in Wisconsin, that you have in other parts of the country, even in other parts of the industrial Midwest. Because during the first migration, most African Americans went to Chicago because they went to Detroit, where those industrial jobs still existed in the 19-teens and 1920s, even with all of the segregation that they faced, even with all of the employment segregation that they faced. There was a growth of a substantial black middle class. For the most part, that didn't happen in Milwaukee and in Wisconsin, because those jobs were already going away. And not only that, but to the extent that the middle class existed, it was ripped apart. It was ripped apart, for example, when 43, the freeway that goes from Milwaukee to Green Bay, was built right through the black middle class neighborhood of Milwaukee. And nobody was compensated for the buildings they lost, for the businesses they lost, not for any of it. It was not considered worthy or important. And so you have a real struggle then in the city just to gain basic rights and opportunities for African Americans. And that is the space within which the movement starts to build. That's the space in which the movement in Milwaukee starts to coalesce. It comes ultimately to be known as the Selma of the North. Patrick Jones, who was a graduate student at UW-Madison, wrote a book called The Selma of the North about race relations in Milwaukee. It is the definitive book on the subject. I would highly encourage everyone to read it. Anyone who cares about race relations in Milwaukee or in Wisconsin really ought to read it. It's really good, and it is the definitive story of the sort of outlines of which I am telling you today. It is called the Selma of the North because it does become a hotbed for activism in the North. It becomes a space where you see a kind of slightly different flavor of civil rights activism than what came before start to emerge in the city and across the state. One that was a little bit more confrontational in its tone. One that was not willing, a little bit more willing to challenge authority in terms of how protests would work. Not violence, but certainly a more confrontational sort of sensibility that becomes part of that movement. The first real civil rights protests started around 1963 in Milwaukee, and that's pretty late, right? I mean, when you think about it, that's just a few months away from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the movement's already been going on for quite some time in the South. What's important to understand is that even for African Americans in the rest of the country, the Civil Rights Movement was perceived as largely Southern. And then for African Americans in the North, there was both a sense of fear about acting when the situation was different for them, and also a sense that actually the civil rights movement in the South was obviously incredibly important, but really wasn't doing much to change their day-to-day lives, right? Wasn't really doing much to change their existence or their circumstances. And so by 1963, by 1964, Northern activists in cities like Milwaukee are starting to say, hey, we need to do something. Hey, we need to start to act to make something happen here in the same way that it has happened in the South. The first real movement for in civil rights activism in Milwaukee was over school segregation. As was the case across the North, the schools in Milwaukee were largely segregated by neighborhood. And as in the South, separate but equal was not. Right? That even though it was a public school, the amount of money that was being spent in a white school was much higher than it was at a black school. And the city could get away with it for the most part because there was no one to tell them that they couldn't. And there was all kinds of political incentive to continue to do that, right? To continue to spend the money disproportionately on the white population in the city. This is what gets challenged in 1964. The leader of that particular movement was a man known as Lloyd Barbie, who actually started it a few years before 1963, but largely in the shadows, and it's only by 64, 65 that the movement becomes more significant. Barbie had graduated as the first black man to graduate from UW-Madison Law School. He was originally, I think, from Tennessee. So he wasn't a native, but he decided to go to Milwaukee to engage in activism. And forms a group called MUSIC, the Milwaukee United School Integration Committee, which was intended to break down the system of segregation that existed across the city. It met with massive resistance. White political leaders didn't want to do anything. At the grassroots level, it was almost impossible to get white parents or local school boards or parent-teacher associations to do anything about it. It was largely left to the black community itself to try to engage. And when it couldn't engage politically, when it couldn't get the Common Council to do anything, when it couldn't get the school board to do anything, they did what happened in the South. They took it to court. So they go to court, they try to figure out what to do next, and slowly but surely work their way through the court system to try to get the city to desegregate its schools. But I want you to look at the dates of the public school segregation suit. 1964 to 1979. 15 years of resistance by the city. 15 years of resistance in the courts before finally Judge John Reynolds, who gets the decision bounced back to him from the United States Supreme Court, orders the city of Milwaukee to start to desegregate its schools. That was the level of resistance. I mean, 15 years. Today I don't think you could do that. Today the system moves much more quickly, but nonetheless, it is incredibly representative of the way in which delaying, obfuscating, making excuses, appealing could slow down this process time and time again. And of course, that means you're getting to 1979, and they're just starting the process of desegregating the schools, right? And starting the system of voluntary busing that becomes part of Milwaukee's school system.
Remind me, what year was Brown's school?
1954. Brown v. Board is 1954. But remember, Brown v. Board doesn't apply to Milwaukee, because Brown v. Board was really applying to the separate but equal system of Plessy versus Ferguson that was used to justify formally segregating schools in the South. In the North, they weren't formally segregated. It wasn't like it was against the law to be black and to go to a white school. What it was dangerous. It was dangerous to do that. And there was no way to get there, because you had to drive halfway across the city to get there, right? And there are all kinds of impediments to actually doing it that were not formal or legal. And so it takes all that time before you get any kind of desegregated school system in the city of Milwaukee. So schools were one of the two main sources of protests in Milwaukee itself. The other was built around open housing laws. It was about this housing segregation issue that I talked about previously. It was about trying to find a way to desegregate a city that was and is deeply segregated to this day. If any of you have read Evicted, which I'm sure many of you probably have, that's a book that really tells you something about the way in which housing is segregated in the city of Milwaukee. It is about white people struggling with housing as well, but it is also about the many additional burdens that African Americans face. It is a brilliant book, and if you haven't read it, by all means, go out and get it. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm really curious about this. So the 15-year pushback is huge, right?
Right.
And so I want to be sure I'm understanding it. Were you proposing or saying that it's partial due to several factors, right? One, no black middle class, because those jobs are already going away.
Correct.
So
Correct.
there wasn't that case. And also this high level of immigrant population who are fighting to show their patriotism, and especially after World War II, high level of Germans wanting to prove their whiteness. And so do you think some of the pushback, residents' pushback in Milwaukee is due to that?
Absolutely. So the question, if you couldn't hear it, is whether some of the pushback to school desegregation was about the circumstances of deindustrialization and also about the way in which the white community was dealing with its own sense of patriotism and its own sense of self. Absolutely. I mean, one thing that's important to understand, especially as we get out of the 60s and into the 1970s, is that the economy is slowing down. By the time you get to 1971, 1972, the great post-World War II economic boom is over. And suddenly people's opportunities are not what they were before. And it is almost an ironclad rule of politics that when things are going well, people tend to be more generous about the circumstances of other people. And when things are not going well, they're not. And there's a certain kind of logic to that, right? If you're worried about whether you're going to get food on the table, if you're worried about your children's future, a lot of other things become peripheral that would otherwise maybe be a little bit more important. There's no question that part of the reason why the civil rights movement succeeds is that it happens in the middle of this massive economic boom. Even then, most white people didn't really support it, but enough did that it suddenly became viable, and that's because the economic and social conditions in the country were pretty good, all things considered. Not to say that there weren't problems or issues, but relatively speaking, they were good. So yes, there's no doubt that that kind of sense of competition and that sense of anxiety is part of it, and then it's built, but also built into this is the long-standing kind of racial tension that exists in America, and that all of those things are part of it. And that, of course, leads then to the kind of housing segregation that we see in the city, which is even worse then because you have this endemic poverty that exists. There were two real leaders in the movement for open housing laws in Milwaukee. One was the great Val Phillips, one of the great Wisconsinites of all time, a woman who broke every possible political boundary and barrier you can imagine. Ends up not only being the first African-American on the city council in Milwaukee, the first African-American to hold statewide office, the first African-American to be a federal judge, she's also the first woman in Wisconsin to do any of those things. And, which is its own story, about how long that took. But she very much engages then in open housing, as a member of the city council in particular, constantly demanding that the common council takes it up, that the mayor takes it up, that they deal with it in some way, and of course, they don't. They don't want to do it, they don't want to deal with it. They see the political calculation as being that I'm going to lose votes if I support this, right? So I don't want to support this, which meant ultimately it had to go to the streets. It had to go to protests, it had to go into finding a way to agitate outside of the general political process. And the other key figure who then becomes part of that story is James Groppe, Father James Groppe, who was a lifetime Wisconsin resident, Italian-American, Catholic priest, who became a kind of unlikely civil rights leader. But was unflinching in his support for civil rights and was in fact really at the kind of vanguard of speaking in blunter terms about the circumstances that existed in the city. One of the things about having such a deeply segregated space is that when things crack, when they break, it's going to be particularly rough and particularly difficult. And that's exactly what happened in Milwaukee in 1967. You had what you could call an upheaval, an uprising, a riot, depends on how you want to call it, in 1967 in the city as African Americans, dealing with a police incident, as often happens in these cases, then expands into a sort of broader protest in the city. It is one that is met with a fierce response from Henry Meyer, who was the mayor of the city and was the mayor of Milwaukee for 28 years, who shut down the whole city. Literally shut down the city, closed off the freeways, closed every business, basically ordered martial law in the city in order to prevent that movement from growing on those days in 1967, and was duly reelected the next year, largely as a result of it. At the same time, the same year that that's happening, you have the marches over the 16th Street Viaduct, the sort of symbolic bridge between white Milwaukee and black Milwaukee across into the south side, from the near south side into the further south side. And those protests were particularly tense and were particularly vicious and violent. And if you ever go to see the video of those protests, you will see Klan symbols, you will see Nazi swastikas, you will see white power signs, you will see all kinds of signs about how James Groppe should be dead. And people firing off gunshots along the perimeter to scare people from going away. But they persisted. They marched day after day, week after week over the course of that summer. And eventually, by the time we get to the end of 1967, we start getting a fair housing law. But again, a law is important. It was a breakthrough. It was one of the key issues of the movement itself. But as you all know, if you read Evicted, it did not resolve these issues very much at all. You look at that map of segregation in the city, it only did so much, right? It only did so much. The problem continued to persist. Next slide. And so where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us in Milwaukee with the most segregated metro area in the entire country. We actually ask experts who do this kind of work about spatial segregation and about residential patterns. They will tell you that the city of Milwaukee looks like most other American cities in 1955. Not really the Happy Days analogy that you want to be thinking, right? But that is the level of segregation. The north, those red sections there are the African American community. The yellow section on the bottom, the Hispanic Latino community in the city. And those lines have been there since the early decades of the 20th century. They've expanded a little because the population has grown, but in their basic dynamics, they remain the same. And of course, you can see what happens after you get out of Milwaukee County itself. And that also is a kind of very 1950s model of racial segregation that is not the case in the same way in many other major metro areas across the country. One of the things that has happened over the last 20 years has been the diversification of the suburbs in many parts of America. Not as profoundly as in cities themselves, but it has happened, but not very much in the Milwaukee County area, in the Milwaukee area, the Milwaukee metropolitan area. In fact, what we have instead is over 100,000 people who move out of the city of Milwaukee and into the WOW counties that surround it. Almost all white who leave at that point. You can see some of the statistics there that tell you a little bit about where we are at. Over half of African American men in their 30s have served jail time in Milwaukee County. Over half of African American men in the city have served jail time. Between 1960 and 2010, the population of the 3 counties around Milwaukee triples to over 600,000. So you have increasing spatial segregation, and you have increased policing within the city of Milwaukee itself, essentially creating a kind of containment area for many African Americans with this kind of hyper-segregated space that exists there. Next slide. And this is Madison. And I'm imagining that most of you know or have heard some version of a lot of these statistics up here. But it bears noting yet again that over half of all African Americans in Dane County live in poverty. In one of the richest counties in the United States. Only 8% of whites live in poverty in Dane County itself. For black children, the poverty rate is around 75%. So that is an unbelievable disparity. You see the numbers about graduating in terms of who graduates from Madison schools and the discrepancy in terms of race that you see there. The percentage who take the ACT, only 36, or the percentage of black students who take the ACT and average certain scores is far lower for African Americans than it is for white students. These are all numbers that speak to the challenges that are in front of us, right? That are in front of us to some degree tomorrow, right? One which I would say that almost everyone running is, talked about and addressed at great length. This is a challenge. This is a challenge when you are dealing with a history of inaction. And when you are dealing with a history of communities that have acted to the extent that they have by trying to contain it, right? By trying to minimize it, by trying to keep it out of sight and out of mind. And of course, so much of what this is about acknowledging it instead of hiding it, right? But that's a significant part of dealing with it in the first place. Next slide. And then about Wisconsin itself, about the whole state. As I said, this is not just the story of the cities, it's the story of the state. Prison population in Wisconsin has tripled since 1990. Not that long ago, right? And so as with the rest of the country, but especially in Wisconsin itself, we have seen incarceration rates skyrocket. And as a result, of course, you're taking people who are already disadvantaged in countless ways, regardless of what they have done, and given them fewer opportunities to recover, to rehabilitate, to find a way to contribute to society again, not to mention the effect that this then has on all of the people who might be maybe depend upon them or count on them in some way or another. Wisconsin has the highest black male incarceration rate in the entire country, and it's not even close. It's not even close. It's almost 13% in Wisconsin, and the next highest is Oklahoma at 9.7%. So it's really not even close. You have massive poverty among people of color in the state, 61% of working families. That doesn't mean people who are unemployed, working people who are living in poverty, right? And that speaks to very big questions we have about our economy and who benefits from it and who does not. And then all the statistics that you see up here about children, about the number of children who are living far below the poverty level and how that breaks down along racial lines. this is an enormous challenge. This is the challenge that Reverend G is talking about when he's talking about the best and the brightest leaving Wisconsin, right? When you talk about that, that's in part about kids looking around at the circumstances they're in and asking themselves how much harder they're going to have to fight here than they would somewhere else where they're going to have to fight and struggle anyway. But I would add to what he said about those African American kids that it's not just the best and the brightest, the African American kids who are unhappy with these circumstances, right? There are a lot of white kids who are not comfortable with this either, right? Who have grown up in a more diverse environment than previous generations, who want to be in a more diverse environment, whose families are more diverse than they were before, right? And are uncomfortable with this dynamic and don't want to be in that space. And so, of course, part of the challenge then is to deal with that too, and to say, how do you deal with that in a way that doesn't force you to compromise your own hopes and dreams, right? Doesn't if you stay, right? Doesn't force you to compromise all of that along the way. Next screen. So I mentioned that Lloyd Barbie had started a few years before 1964 with a protest that he was doing about looking for racial justice in Wisconsin. This is a protest in the rotunda of the Madison Capitol in 1961 of African Americans who stayed there for several days. Sound familiar? This movement has been around here for a while. It is not new that African Americans are here fighting for their own rights and fighting for their own opportunity. It is not new that they are struggling to make their voices heard. But it really does remain an uphill battle. There is real resistance in this state to grappling with this reality, to, in a sense, grappling with the future, right? I mean, this is about the reality of what the future is going to be. And you know, when I started last time, I talked about nostalgia, and I talked about how we tend to bathe ourselves in nostalgia, and we tend to live kind of comfortably in this space where we can imagine this world that existed in the past, that was peaceful and that was prosperous, and maybe, but certainly not for everybody, right? Not for everybody, and we still do that. We still very deeply connect to this sense of nostalgia and don't want to grapple with these questions, and instead try to think about how to reconstruct something that was never really all that great in the first place, but which we can't go back to in any way, right? There's no going back to that. The question is whether you want to move forward, whether you want to take all of this stuff we know about the past, not to live in the past, but to try to find a way to live better in the future. That is it from me. Thank you very much.
Very, very compelling lecture. Thank you for that. A couple just quick reminders before we dismiss you all to your small groups. One, we've said it before, we'll say it again, tomorrow is election day. And so you get an opportunity to answer that question that many of you ask when they come to the history class. What can I do to help? Well, tomorrow you get a chance to help with your vote. So just make sure that you're voting for the people who are going to address the issues in a way that is going to help those who need it most, and not just a way that makes us feel comfortable with the status quo. So that's not pushing for any political party or one or the other, or any particular candidate, but just make sure that in those, and then after the election comes through, keep those people accountable. The other thing we can do, on April 15th, we're going to have our potluck. It's going to be time for us to talk, reflect, just be together without a lecture. Get a chance to really talk to one another. And so, if you don't remember, there was an email that went out that had a potluck sign up. So that way we wouldn't have a table of just desserts, although there's some merit to that. But just so that way we know we have a good spread of every type of dish. Please sign up and if for some reason you can't bring a dish, you can still come. But if you can, please do that. We'd love to see you there. And one last announcement. On April the 10th, Leleda is going to have her giving circle, and that's going to be at Short Stack Eatery. And so that's going to be at 5:30 to 7. Come hungry, bring a friend, and please RSVP so that way they know they have enough space for you at that. But if you want to get more involved with what Leleda is doing and defending Black girlhood, dealing with Black women, this is a great opportunity for you to do that. So thank you all so much, and we'll dismiss you now to your small groups.